What would you do if a forgotten letter from your past revealed a heartbreaking secret? Watch the video and enjoy my new story. I sat in my office, staring at the letter in front of me. It had been 3 years since Andrew's death, and I hadn't known. I hadn't known that the person I once considered my best friend had passed away, and now here I was holding the invitation to his funeral in my hands like some cruel joke from the past. The envelope was yellowed with age, the paper inside worn at the edges as though it had been forgotten in some dusty corner. I had found it buried beneath a pile of old files, hidden away like it had been waiting for me to open it, to remember. The date on the letter was clear, though. 3 years ago, nearly to the day. I stared at the words, my mind still struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. You're invited to the funeral of Andrew Carter. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Andrew, the same Andrew who had been my best friend for as long as I could remember. We'd grown up together in a small town, shared everything, dreams, laughter, fights, and the kind of bond that only childhood friends could know. But somewhere along the way, life had pulled us in different directions. I closed my eyes, the memories rushing back. Andrew and I were inseparable in our early years. We'd spent summers riding bikes down the narrow streets of our town, sneaking into abandoned houses and talking about everything and nothing. He was always the quieter one, steady, reliable, while I had been the one who dreamed bigger, reaching for something outside the confines of our small world. But after high school, things changed. I went off to college, determined to build a future for myself in the city, while Andrew stayed behind, working as a mechanic at his father's shop. We drifted apart slowly, and when I finally returned home for the first time after graduation, the distance between us was more than just physical. It was like we'd been living in different realities for years. We tried to reconnect, of course. I'd call him now and then, but our conversations felt strained, like we were both too different, too far removed from the boys we used to be. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. I had my life in the city, and he had his job in the shop. We were just strangers with a history. But now, as I held the letter, I realized how much I had taken for granted. The years that had passed without me checking on him, without making an effort to bridge the gap, and now it was too late. He was gone, and I hadn't even known he was sick. I pushed the letter away, my thoughts swirling. What had happened? Why hadn't I known? It wasn't like Andrew to keep things from me, but then again, maybe it was. Maybe he had always been good at hiding the hard stuff. I reached for my phone and dialed my lawyer's number. "Daniel," John's voice answered, groggy, probably just waking up. "I need you to look into something for me," I said, my voice tight. "I need to know about Andrew Carter's family, his wife, his kids, anything you can find." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Just get me the information, John. Don't ask questions." Another pause then. "Fine, I'll get started on it, but you'll owe me one." I hung up without another word. My mind was still racing, piecing together the fragments of the past, trying to make sense of it all. Hours later, my lawyer called back with the information. "Daniel, I've got some details for you," John said. "Andrew's wife is named Lila Carter. They've got a daughter, Maddie. The thing is, it doesn't look like they're doing well. They're barely scraping by, Daniel. Lila's been struggling financially ever since Andrew got sick. He hadn't been able to work for months before his death. I'm talking about a pretty bad situation here. Medical bills piling up, debts, you name it." I felt the sting of those words, my chest tightening. This wasn't what I had expected. I hadn't known that Andrew's family was in such trouble. He'd never mentioned a word about it, not once. "You need to help them," John continued. "You've got the means to do it. You could fix their situation in a heartbeat." "I know," I said quietly. I wasn't sure why, but hearing those words, "fix their situation," stirred something inside me. I sat back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. Andrew had never asked for help. In fact, he'd always been the one to help others, especially me. I had assumed he was fine, that everything was going well for him. But now I understood how wrong I had been. Lila and Maddie, his family, were struggling, and I hadn't even known. I stood up, my mind made up. It was time to make things right. I couldn't undo the past, but I could make sure Andrew's family didn't have to suffer because of my ignorance. The next day, I made arrangements to meet Lila. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them go through this alone. The past couldn't be changed, but I could change their future. I just hoped I could prove to Lila that I wasn't just another wealthy stranger looking for a way to feel good about himself. I hoped she would see me for who I really was, someone who owed it to Andrew and to them to step in. As I walked out of my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would be harder than I imagined. But it was the only path I could take now, and I was going to make it count. Tracking down Lila was easy. Money makes things like this happen. But I wasn't prepared for the way she slammed the door in my face when I introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Daniel Ashcroft," I said, holding out my hand, trying to sound casual despite the weight of the situation. She took one look at me, her hazel eyes narrowing with suspicion, before shaking her head. "I don't have time for this," she said, her voice sharp. "Goodbye." I barely had time to register what had just happened before the door clicked shut in my face. I stood there for a second, dumbfounded. Did I just get rejected by a woman I didn't even know? I could feel the breeze against my suit and the sting of her dismissal. I wasn't used to this. Usually, people at least pretended to listen. I sighed and took a step back. Maybe it was the suit, or maybe she just didn't want anything to do with someone like me. I could respect that, but I wasn't going to give up that easily. The next day I returned. This time I didn't ring the bell. Instead, I stood by the side of the house and waited for her to come outside. I wasn't about to be brushed off again. When she did step onto the porch, she was holding a basket of laundry. She caught sight of me standing there, and her brow furrowed. "Really? You're still here?" Lila's tone was half annoyed, half incredulous. "Can we talk?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She exhaled sharply and set the basket down on the porch railing. "We already talked. I told you to go." "I know, but I didn't explain myself. Please just give me 5 minutes." Her eyes narrowed again, clearly debating whether or not to listen to me. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but you get 5 minutes and no funny business, got it?" "Funny business?" I blinked. "You think I'm here to... what? Make a deal?" "I don't know," she snapped. "You're a billionaire, and I'm supposed to just trust you. People like you always want something. Usually, something I don't have time to give." I nodded slowly, acknowledging her point. "Fair, but I'm not here to take anything from you, Lila. I'm here because I found out about Andrew, and I want to help. I know it's late, but you don't have to do this alone." For a moment, she just stared at me. Then her gaze softened, but she still didn't seem entirely convinced. "You're the one who couldn't be bothered to check up on us until now? And you think a couple of checks are going to fix everything?" I shrugged. "No, I don't. I'm not offering you money. I'm offering you a job." Her eyebrows shot up. "A job? From you? As what, a personal assistant?" "More like a right-hand woman," I said, trying to keep it light, though I was starting to feel the weight of her suspicion. She tilted her head, clearly intrigued but still wary. "I've already got a job, and I'm not interested in becoming anyone's charity case." "I'm not trying to make you one," I said quickly. "But if you'd take a chance on me, maybe I could make things easier. You could do something you're good at. You don't have to worry about where the next paycheck's coming from. You just..." She raised a hand to stop me. "I don't need your charity, Daniel. I've worked hard to get here. I've managed just fine, and I'll keep doing it on my own. So, thank you, but no thank you." I didn't push further. I could see the walls she'd built up around herself, but I wasn't ready to walk away. "All right, but at least let me meet Maddie. I'm sure she's wondering who's been knocking on her mother's door all day." Lila's expression flickered for a moment. Was it surprise? Regret? Then, just as quickly, her face hardened again. "Fine," she said, sighing, "but you're wasting your time." Lila led me into the small, cluttered house. It wasn't the kind of place that screamed luxury. The walls were lined with family photos, and there were unfinished projects piled up on every surface. As we passed through the living room, I caught sight of a little girl sitting on the floor, drawing something on a sheet of paper. The girl looked up, her big brown eyes locking onto mine. "Mom?" she asked, her voice tentative, as though she wasn't sure if it was okay to speak to a stranger. "Come here, Maddie," Lila said softly. "This is Daniel. He's an old friend of your dad's. Maddie blinked at me, sizing me up in a way that made me feel more nervous than I expected. Then, without warning, she stood up, her stuffed rabbit trailing behind her. "Are you a superhero?" she asked, her voice filled with the pure curiosity that only a child's questions could carry. I glanced at Lila, who was looking anywhere but at me. "Well, I'm definitely not a superhero," I said with a smile, crouching down to her level. "But I do like to think I'm good at solving problems." Maddie studied me for a long moment before giving me a slow nod. "You can help Mommy?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "I can," I said, my heart tightening. It was the first time anyone had asked me for anything in a way that didn't feel transactional. Lila didn't say anything, but I could tell the weight of my words had hit her. "You're really good at talking to people, aren't you?" Lila said after a pause, her arms still crossed, though her tone was softer now. I chuckled. "Not always, but when it's important, I guess I try." She stared at me for a long moment. "You don't know anything about us, Daniel. You don't understand how hard it is to let someone else in. Not when you've had to be strong for so long." I nodded, swallowing the growing lump in my throat. "I get it, and I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I want to help, if you'll let me." She glanced down at Maddie, who was now tugging on her sleeve, and then back at me. For the first time, she didn't look like she was preparing for a fight. "I'm not sure I can," Lila murmured, almost to herself. "But maybe we can give it a shot." That was the first crack in the walls she'd built. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and I wasn't going to give up. Not now. Lila threw herself into the job with the precision of someone who'd been juggling chaos for years. She kept my schedule tight, argued with me over unnecessary meetings, and somehow managed to make me laugh at the most inconvenient times. And then there was Maddie. She became a fixture in my office, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand while she peppered me with questions. "Why don't you have a family?" Maddie asked one afternoon, her big brown eyes watching me intently. I hesitated, glancing at Lila, who was pretending not to listen. "I'm very busy," Maddie wrinkled her nose. "That's a silly reason." "Out of the mouths of babes," Lila muttered under her breath, smirking when I shot her a look. It wasn't long before I started looking forward to those moments. Lila's dry humor, Maddie's unfiltered honesty, the warmth they brought into my otherwise sterile life. Lila was a puzzle, fiercely independent, maddeningly stubborn, and yet kind. Maddie's laughter was contagious, but Lila's smile, that was rare. And when it appeared, it was like seeing the sun for the first time after years of rain. One night, after Maddie had fallen asleep on the office couch, Lila and I shared a quiet moment. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her voice soft but guarded. "Because I owe it to Andrew," I said honestly, "and because I want to." She looked at me then, her walls cracking just a little. "You're a hard man to figure out, Daniel." "Good," I replied. "I'd hate to be predictable." She laughed, a soft, unexpected sound, and I felt something shift between us. Just as things started to feel comfortable, I made a mistake. A big one. Lila found out about the trust fund I'd set up for Maddie. I'd meant it as a gesture of security, but to her it was an insult. "You think you can just buy our future?" she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "It's not like that," I tried to explain. "I just wanted to help." "I didn't ask for your help, Daniel. I asked for a job. I wanted to stand on my own, not be another line item in your charity ledger." Her words stung more than I cared to admit. She quit the next day. For days, my office felt empty. Maddie's laughter was gone, and so was Lila's sharp wit. I'd thought I was helping, but I'd only pushed her away. It hit me then. This wasn't about Andrew anymore. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about Lila and Maddie. They weren't just a responsibility. They were my future. I found them in a park, Maddie bundled up in a coat too big for her, swinging high while Lila watched from a bench. "I screwed up," I said, sitting beside her. "Yeah, you did," she replied, but her voice was softer this time. "I wasn't trying to control you," I said. I want you and Maddie in my life. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, because I love you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought I'd said too much. Then she smiled, a real breathtaking smile, and took my hand. "You're a lot of work, Daniel Ashcroft," she said. "Good," I replied, grinning. "I'd hate to be predictable." Maddie ran over then, dragging her rabbit and demanding we all go get ice cream. As Lila laughed and Maddie tugged us both toward the car, I realized I finally had what I'd been searching for: a family.
The room is unbearably quiet. I stand in the doorway, unsure if I have the strength to step inside. It's been 2 weeks and I still can't bring myself to touch anything. Her scent lingers, soft, floral, faint, like the last breath of spring clinging to winter air. The walls are still painted that pale lavender she loved so much, though the sunlight filtering through the curtains makes them look gray. Her bed is made just as she left it. A small stuffed bear sits propped against the pillow, a gift from her 10th birthday. I remember the way she clutched it that day, beaming as though I'd handed her the world. Now it's just another relic in a room frozen in time, untouched and unoccupied. I step closer, my hand brushing the desk, where a stack of sketchbooks lies in a neat pile. She always kept her things orderly, even when her life was unraveling. My fingers hesitate above the top notebook, the edges worn from her constant flipping. I've avoided opening it, afraid of what I might find, or worse, what I might not. Instead, my gaze drifts to the window, where faint streaks of condensation blur the view of the garden below. The flowers she planted last summer are still there, withering now, but stubbornly holding on. The irony isn't lost on me. I pick up the journal from her bedside table, the one she always kept close but never let me read. It's heavier than I expected, as though it holds the weight of her untold thoughts. I flip it open, my hands trembling, and the first page greets me with her delicate handwriting. To the world, I seem quiet, but inside I'm screaming. The words hit me like a punch to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. I sink onto her bed, clutching the book like it's the only piece of her I have left. My tears fall, staining the ink, but I can't stop. I want to tell her I'm sorry. I want to tell her I would have done anything to take away her pain. I want to tell her I wasn't strong enough to save her. But all I can do is sit here in the silence she left behind, trying to piece together the fragments of a girl I thought I knew. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find her in these pages. The changes started so subtly I almost missed them. Emma had always been a quiet child. Thoughtful, observant, more interested in books than playground drama. At 13, I assumed her growing moodiness was just a symptom of adolescence. She still smiled, still laughed, still curled up on the couch to watch movies with me on Friday nights. But then the silences became heavier, weighted with something I couldn't name. She stopped talking about her friends, brushing off my questions with one-word answers. Her laughter came less often. Her smiles turned into forced curvatures of the lips. One evening, I found her sitting alone in her room, staring at the wall. Her homework lay untouched on the desk. When I asked what was wrong, she shrugged and said she was tired. It was a simple enough answer, but something in her voice, flat, distant, pricked at me. I tried to push the worry aside. Teenage girls were complicated, I told myself. Hormonal, emotional. But the knot in my stomach tightened each time I caught her staring into space, her shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. One day, I noticed she was wearing long sleeves in the middle of summer. She flinched when I asked about it and muttered something about being cold. The conversation stuck with me, a nagging suspicion that wouldn't leave. I didn't realize then how much I was already losing her. It wasn't Emma who told me. It was a friend of hers, a girl named Mia, who let it slip during a rushed conversation in my kitchen. She hasn't been herself since, what happened last year. Mia had said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Mia's face turned pale, and her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an escape route. I thought you knew. She told me not to say anything. I pressed her until the truth came tumbling out in fragmented sentences. A boy from school, a party Emma hadn't wanted to go to, something she had never consented to. When Mia left, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of me. My mind reeled with questions I didn't know how to ask. Why didn't she tell me? How could I not have noticed? I went to Emma's room that evening, my hands trembling as I knocked on her door. She looked up from her desk, her face pale under the glow of the lamp. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice breaking. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the child she used to be, the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. Then her expression hardened, and she turned away. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It's over." I sat on the edge of her bed, struggling to find the right words. "Emma, this isn't something you just move past. You don't have to go through this alone. Please talk to me." She didn't look at me. "I'm fine," she said, her voice brittle, but she wasn't fine. I could see it in the way her hands trembled when she reached for her phone, in the dark circles under her eyes. I wanted to hold her, to tell her I'd protect her, that nothing like this would ever happen again. But she pulled away from me, retreating into the silence that had become her armor. The first therapist didn't work out. Neither did the second. Each time, Emma would sit stiffly in the chair, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the floor. She answered their questions in clipped sentences, giving nothing away. After a few sessions, she refused to go back. "It's a waste of time," she said. But I couldn't give up. I spent hours researching trauma counselors, reading reviews, calling offices, and begging for appointments. I didn't care about the cost or the waiting lists. All I cared about was getting her the help she needed. When I finally found someone she liked, a gentlewoman named Dr. Shan Patel, I felt a flicker of hope. Emma still didn't say much during their sessions, but she started drawing again. I took it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, we were making progress. There were good days when I'd catch a glimpse of the old Emma, the one who used to dance around the kitchen while singing off-key. But the bad days were still there, lurking like shadows in the corners of our lives. One night, I found her crying in the bathroom, her wrists red and raw. My heart shattered as I wrapped her in my arms, rocking her back and forth like I used to when she was little. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She just sobbed against my shoulder, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind. In that moment, I realized that loving her meant fighting for her, even when she didn't have the strength to fight for herself, and I promised her I would never stop. The day Emma turned 15 was colder than I'd expected for early spring. I remember the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window as she sat across from me, toying with her cereal. Her face was thinner by then, her once rosy cheeks pale and hollowed. She barely looked up when I handed her the small gift I'd bought, a necklace with a delicate star pendant. "Thanks," she murmured, sliding it into her pocket without opening the box. Later that evening, as I cleared her laundry from the bathroom floor, I found the crumpled piece of notebook paper. The handwriting wasn't hers, but the words burned into my mind like a brand. "You'll never be anything but broken." It wasn't until weeks later that I discovered the source. An older boy she'd trusted, someone who had been kind to her when she was vulnerable, someone who had shattered her trust all over again. Emma refused to press charges. "It's not worth it," she said, her voice flat and lifeless. "It won't change anything." Her refusal crushed me, but I respected her choice. It wasn't my pain to bear, though I felt every ounce of it like a knife twisting in my chest. After that, Emma's bad days outnumbered the good. She dropped out of extracurriculars, stopped answering her friends' texts, and began spending hours locked in her room. I caught glimpses of her struggles. Empty pill bottles shoved under her mattress, scribbled notes in her sketchbooks that read like cries for help. Once I found a drawing of a girl standing on the edge of a cliff, her shadow stretching long and dark behind her. "Emma, we need to talk about this," I said, holding the sketch in my hands. Her eyes flicked to the paper before darting away. "It's just a drawing," she muttered. But I knew better. I tried everything, therapy, medication, support groups, but nothing seemed to reach her. She went through the motions, attending sessions and taking her prescriptions, but the light in her eyes had dimmed to a flicker. One night, I found her sitting on the kitchen floor with a kitchen knife in her lap. My heart stopped. "Emma, no," I whispered, rushing to her side. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore, Mom," she sobbed. "It hurts too much." I held her tightly, my own tears falling into her hair. "We'll find a way," I promised. "We'll keep trying. Just hold on." But deep down, I could feel her slipping away. The morning Emma told me about her decision, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've applied for euthanasia," she said, her voice steady. "It's legal now, for mental suffering." I stared at her, unable to process the words. "Emma, you can't be serious." Her eyes met mine, calm and resolute. "I am. I've thought about this for a long time. It's the only way I'll ever feel peace." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "No, there has to be another way. You're too young to make this decision. You haven't given yourself enough time to heal." She shook her head. "I've tried, Mom. I've tried everything. Therapy, medication, art, exercise, you name it, I've done it. But the pain never goes away. It's always there, like a weight I can't lift." I wanted to argue, to plead with her, to tell her that life would get better if she just held on a little longer. But the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't anger or defiance, it was exhaustion. "I love you," she said softly, "and I know this will hurt you, but I need you to understand that this isn't about you. It's about me, and I can't keep living like this." I broke down, sobbing into my hands as she sat quietly across from me. When I finally looked up, she reached out and took my hand. "Please, Mom," she whispered. "I need you to be with me when the time comes." The weeks that followed were a blur of emotions. I oscillated between anger and despair, begging her to reconsider and trying to understand her decision. I read articles, consulted therapists, and attended support groups for parents of suicidal teens, hoping someone could give me the right words to change her mind. But no one could. "She's not in her right mind," I told Dr. Patel during a tearful session. "How can they let her make a decision like this?" Dr. Patel's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Emma's pain is real, Sarah. And in her mind, this is the only solution. It's not about agreeing with her. It's about supporting her in the way she needs." Supporting her felt impossible, but the thought of her going through this alone was worse. In the quiet hours of the night, I sat in her room, running my fingers over the worn pages of her journal. I read her words over and over, trying to find the moment when I lost her. But the truth was, she had been slipping through my fingers for years. One evening, as I watched her sketch at the dining table, I realized how at peace she seemed. The lines of her drawing were steady, her face relaxed. It was the first time in years I'd seen her without the shadow of pain clouding her features. And in that moment, I understood that this was her way of reclaiming control over a life that had stolen so much from her. The day Emma's request was approved, she sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand. "I know you don't agree with this," she said, "and I don't expect you to, but it means everything to me that you're here." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. In the weeks leading up to the procedure, we spent as much time together as we could. We cooked her favorite meals, watched her favorite movies, and stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. There were moments when I thought about running, packing her into the car and driving somewhere far away where no one could find us. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. All I could do was hold her close and pray that I was doing the right thing, even if it felt like my heart was being torn in two. The day arrived too quickly, as if time itself conspired against me. The morning was calm, almost cruelly serene, with sunlight spilling through the windows like nothing had changed. Emma was quiet, but not withdrawn. She spent the morning sitting in her room, sketching while I made breakfast. I hovered in the doorway, watching her pencil move steadily across the paper. "What are you drawing?" I asked, my voice trembling. She turned the sketch pad toward me. It was a garden filled with wildflowers, sunlight streaming through the trees. "A place I'd like to visit," she said softly. I didn't trust myself to respond. Instead, I walked over and kissed her on the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her shampoo as if trying to memorize it. At the clinic, everything was sterile and quiet. The staff spoke in hushed tones, their kindness piercing through the haze of my grief. Emma held my hand as we walked to the room. Her grip was steady, her face calm. "I love you, Mom," she said as she lay down on the bed. "I love you too," I choked out. My voice cracked under the weight of those 3 words, knowing they were the last ones she'd hear from me. I held her hand until it went still. In the days following her death, the house felt unbearably empty. I avoided her room, unable to face the stillness that now seemed suffocating. The lavender walls that once brought her comfort now felt like a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. Everywhere I turned, there were echoes of her. Her drawings scattered on the dining table, her books lined up neatly on the shelf, her favorite mug sitting unwashed in the sink. Each object was a fragment of her life, and together they formed a mosaic of grief that I couldn't escape. I spent hours reading her journal, searching for answers, for understanding. Her words were raw and unfiltered, a window into the depths of her pain. I cried over every page, mourning the girl she had been and the woman she would never become. But amid the sorrow, I found glimpses of hope. "I'm not giving up," she had written. "I'm choosing peace." I began to question everything, my decisions, my role as her mother, the society that had failed her. I attended a support group for parents who had lost children to suicide, hoping to find solace in shared pain. "What do you tell yourself to keep going?" I asked during one meeting, my voice barely above a whisper. A woman sitting across from me, her face lined with years of grief, gave me a sad smile. "I tell myself that love is the only thing we can hold on to," she said. "Even if it wasn't enough to save them, it was enough to matter." Her words stuck with me, though they didn't ease the ache in my chest. Months passed, and I found myself drawn to Emma's art. Her sketchbooks were filled with landscapes she'd never visited, people she'd never met, and emotions she couldn't put into words. I decided to compile her work into a collection, a tribute to the beauty she created despite the pain she carried. I worked late into the nights, scanning her drawings, organizing her notes, and writing introductions for each piece. When the collection was published, I received letters from people who saw themselves in Emma's story, survivors, parents, siblings, friends. They thanked me for sharing her truth, for giving a voice to the struggles so many kept hidden. It didn't bring her back, but it gave her life a meaning that extended beyond her pain. One morning, as I walked through the garden Emma had planted the summer before, I noticed something new. Among the withered flowers, a single wildflower had bloomed, its petals bright and defiant against the frost. I knelt beside it, running my fingers over its delicate petals. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: hope. Emma's loss would always be a part of me, a scar that never fully healed. But her life, her love, and her art had left a mark on the world that couldn't be erased. As I stood in the sunlight, I realized that while her story had ended, mine was still being written, and maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to carry her with me, not as a weight, but as a light. It's been 2 years since Emma left now, and the world has moved on. At least that's what it looks like on the surface. The seasons change, the sun rises and sets, and people pass me on the street with smiles that don't falter. But for me, time has slowed. I've kept her room the same, though I visit it less now. Her scent has faded from the sheets, her notebooks remain untouched, and the necklace I gave her on her 15th birthday still hangs on the bedpost. Sometimes I sit on the edge of her bed, running my fingers over the star pendant, wondering if she ever wore it when I wasn't looking. I've spent countless hours in the garden, the one Emma and I planted together the summer before everything unraveled. She'd insisted on wildflowers, saying they reminded her of freedom, of how beauty could thrive even in chaos. At first, tending to it felt like a chore, a futile attempt to keep something alive when so much had been lost, but over time it became my solace. This year the garden has flourished like never before. The flowers are taller, their colors brighter, as if the earth itself is trying to tell her story. I've started planting more: sunflowers, daisies, even lavender, each one a small act of defiance against the void her absence left behind. Last week, I received a letter from a young woman named Clara. She had seen Emma's art collection online and recognized herself in the sketches and words. "Her drawings gave me courage," the letter said, "to tell my story, to seek help, to believe that I'm more than my pain. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but please know that Emma saved me." I sat on the porch, the letter trembling in my hands, tears spilling onto the page. For the first time, I felt something other than guilt, other than loss. I felt pride. Emma had always said she wasn't strong, but she was wrong. She didn't just survive, she created, she loved, and now, even in her absence, she healed. Today I walk into the garden with a basket full of seeds. As I kneel in the dirt, pressing each one into the soil, I think about Emma's favorite sketch, the one she showed me on her last morning, a garden filled with wildflowers. "I'll make it for you," I whisper to the wind. "I'll make it everything you dreamed of." As I finish planting the last seed, the sun breaks through the clouds, bathing the garden in golden light. It feels like a blessing, like a quiet reassurance that she is still here in some way, woven into every petal, every blade of grass. The pain hasn't disappeared, and I doubt it ever will. But now it feels softer, like a bruise instead of a gaping wound. And as I rise to my feet, brushing the dirt from my hands, I realize that the garden isn't just for Emma anymore. It's for me too. For us both. He left her with nothing. Years later, she stunned everyone at her ex's father's will reading. Subscribe to the channel and enjoy my new stories every day. The rain came down in slashing sheets, blurring the outline of the sprawling Silver Creek Rancho against the horizon. Claire Bennett gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the leather, as her car crawled up the muddy driveway. The rancho stood defiant, a monument to a life she'd been cast out of years ago. It hadn't changed. The grand adobe-style house with its arched windows, the rusted iron gates that had once felt like a promise but now loomed like a warning. She parked near the barn, her headlights catching glimpses of skittish horses in their pens. The storm had unsettled them, and she understood why. This place had a way of stirring the unease buried deep inside. Stepping out into the downpour, Claire pulled her coat tighter, though it did little to shield her. Mud clung to her boots as she walked toward the entrance. Her chest tightened at the sight of the heavy oak doors. She remembered the first time she'd stood there, nervous but hopeful, with Liam's arm around her waist. Now, her chest burned with something sharper, defiance. The past always came in fragments, sharp and uninvited. Driving through the storm to Silver Creek Rancho, Claire had tried to keep her mind blank, but memories crept in like unwelcome shadows. She saw herself at 25, stepping onto the ranch for the first time. The sun had been unforgiving that day, but Liam's smile had been even brighter. He'd taken her hand, leading her through the gates as if he were introducing her to a kingdom she would someday rule. "You'll love it here," he'd promised, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence that made her believe him. And for a while, she did. At first, it had been a dream. The ranch workers treated her with cautious respect, and William, Liam's father, had seemed amused by her awkward attempts to fit into their world. She'd thrown herself into learning how to ride, how to manage accounts, how to host the kind of parties the Bennetts were known for. It had all been for Liam, who had stood by her side with that easy charm that made her heart race. But cracks had formed early on. Little things. A dismissive comment about her small-town manners, the way he brushed off her ideas as cute. Claire had ignored them, convincing herself it was all part of the adjustment. She loved him, and love meant compromise. It wasn't until their third anniversary that the facade shattered. She'd overheard Liam on the phone, his voice low and conspiratorial. At first, she thought he was planning a surprise. But the words she caught made her stomach drop. She doesn't need to know. It's not like she'd understand. The affair came to light soon after, but it wasn't just the betrayal of another woman. It was the betrayal of everything. He'd used her, discarded her, and made sure she left the ranch with nothing. No settlement, no belongings, just the ache of knowing she'd been a pawn in his game. The years that followed were hard. Claire rebuilt her life in a modest apartment, working long hours at a job she hated. But the pain had forged something new in her, a quiet, unyielding strength. Liam had taken everything, but he hadn't broken her. Now, as she stood on the threshold of Silver Creek Rancho again, she wasn't the naive woman who had walked through those gates years ago. This time, she wasn't here to be welcomed. William Bennett, Liam's father and late ranch owner, passed away a few weeks ago, and his lawyer invited Claire for William's will reading. The door swung open before she could knock. "Claire!" His voice was the same, smooth and calculated, but the warmth she once craved was gone. Liam stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light, His face was a portrait of disdain. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." "Surprise," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. She brushed past him, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the pristine tile. If he wanted a fight, she wouldn't disappoint. Inside, the familiar scents of leather and cedar filled the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of cigar smoke. Around the grand dining table stood the people who had once been her family, or so she'd believed. Liam's new wife, Marissa, was perched on a chair like a viper waiting to strike. Others stared at her with barely concealed contempt. Claire squared her shoulders. Let them glare. She wasn't here to apologize. The lawyer, a stiff man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, cleared his throat. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin." And just like that, the storm outside felt tame compared to the one brewing in the room. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that seeped into the walls and made the air heavy. Claire sat stiffly in the leather armchair, her damp coat draped over the back. Across from her, Liam leaned casually against the fireplace mantel, his expression smug and indifferent. Marissa, his perfectly polished wife, sat beside him, her manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm on the armrest of her chair. The lawyer, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stood at the head of the grand dining table, shuffling papers with methodical precision. His glasses slid down his nose as he cleared his throat for what felt like the 100th time. "I'll keep this brief," he began, his voice flat and professional. William Bennett was a man who valued hard work, loyalty, and family. His will reflects those principles. "Get on with it," Liam muttered, earning a sharp glare from the lawyer. Claire's gaze flicked to Liam. She recognized the impatience in his tone. It wasn't grief. It was the eagerness of a man ready to claim what he thought was rightfully his. "As per the terms of Mr. Bennett's will," the lawyer continued, his voice steady, "the entirety of Silver Creek Rancho, including all assets and properties, will be inherited by—" He paused, glancing at the paper, and for the first time, his professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of discomfort. "Claire Bennett." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. "What?" Liam's voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence. He pushed off the mantel, his face twisting with disbelief. "That's impossible. There's no way." "William made his intentions very clear," the lawyer interrupted, his tone firm. "Silver Creek Rancho is to be passed to Claire Bennett under the condition that she resides on the property for a minimum of 6 months." "This is ridiculous." Marissa's voice was shrill, her perfect composure cracking. "She doesn't belong here. She left years ago." Claire sat frozen, the words struggling to sink in. Inherited the ranch? It didn't make sense. William had barely tolerated her when she was married to Liam. Why would he leave her everything? "This has to be a mistake," Liam growled, stepping toward the table. "Let me see that." The lawyer held up a hand, stopping him. "It's all in writing, Mr. Bennett. Your father was very clear. Should Ms. Bennett fail to meet the residency requirement, the property will then pass to you." Liam turned his glare on Claire, his eyes dark with fury. "You can't honestly think you're going to stay here?" he spat. "You've got no claim to this place. No right." Claire straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze head-on. The years of being intimidated by him were long behind her. "According to your father, I do." Her voice was calm but cold, her words laced with a challenge. "You won't last a week," he sneered. "Try me." The tension tightened, the room silent except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows. Finally, the lawyer spoke again, breaking the standoff. "If there are no further questions, I'll proceed with the formalities." Liam let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he stalked toward the door. "This isn't over, Claire," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "I never thought it would be," she replied, watching him go. As the door slammed behind him, Claire allowed herself a small, shaky breath. She didn't know what game William Bennett had been playing by leaving her the ranch, but she wasn't about to back down. Not this time. That night, Claire stayed at the ranch. The rain had turned to a soft drizzle by the time Claire ventured into the study, a room she hadn't dared to step into since her return. It was William Bennett's sanctuary, filled with mahogany bookshelves, old maps, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to linger no matter how much time had passed. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Closure, perhaps? Answers? Or maybe just a distraction from the weight of her newfound responsibilities. The ranch was hers, but it felt more like a burden than a blessing. A stray draft caught her attention, rustling a stack of yellowed papers on the desk. Claire hesitated, then approached, her fingers brushing the edges of the pages. Beneath the stack was a small wooden box, its surface scratched and worn. She opened it, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her breath caught. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakable, William's. Each one was addressed to her. She slid the ribbon off with trembling hands and unfolded the top letter. The words leapt off the page, sharp and deliberate, just like the man who had written them. Claire, if you're reading this, it means the ranch is now in your hands. I imagine you're confused, maybe even angry. I wouldn't blame you. But there are things you don't know, things I should have said long ago. This ranch isn't just a piece of land, it's a lifeline, a legacy, and for you, a second chance. Her chest tightened. She read on, devouring each letter, each revelation. William had known about Liam's betrayal, his lies, his infidelities, and had watched in silence as Claire's marriage crumbled. He'd admired her resilience, her quiet strength, even as she walked away from everything. But the letters revealed more than sympathy. They spoke of regret, of a man who had spent years trying to atone for his coldness, his stubborn pride. William had seen Claire as more than his son's ex-wife. He'd seen her as the only person capable of keeping the ranch alive. The land is tough, Claire, but so are you. I trust you to make it thrive, to make it your own. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that this place can heal the parts of you were broken. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the last letter and placed it back in the box. The weight of the inheritance shifted slightly. No longer just a responsibility, but a gift. One she wasn't sure she deserved, but felt compelled to honor. The first weeks were brutal. Claire had underestimated how much work the ranch required. The mornings came too early, the days stretched too long, and her body ached in places she didn't even know existed. Fences needed mending, cattle needed tending, and the financial ledgers William had left behind painted a grim picture. The ranch was on the brink of collapse. More than once, she thought about giving up, about packing her bags and walking away. The voices of doubt were loud and relentless. Liam's taunts echoed in her mind, feeding the insecurities that had lingered since her divorce. But then there were moments, small, fleeting victories that kept her going. The first time she repaired a section of fence on her own, her hands raw and blistered. The unexpected kindness of Javier, the ranch foreman, who stayed late to teach her how to wrangle cattle. The satisfaction of balancing the books late at night, finding a way to stretch every dollar just a little further. And then there was the land itself. The sunsets over the sprawling pastures, the quiet hum of the cicadas, the crisp morning air that carried the scent of earth and wildflowers. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with this place so many years ago. But growth wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She began to confront the wounds Liam had left behind, the way his betrayal had shattered her self-worth. Slowly, she started to rebuild herself, piece by piece. The letters from William became her guide, his words a steady presence in her darkest moments. When Liam returned, demanding to buy her out, she stood her ground. His threats no longer had power over her. "This ranch isn't for sale," she told him, her voice firm and unwavering. "And neither am I." For the first time in years, she felt like the person William had seen in her letters, a woman of strength, resilience, and unyielding determination. Claire wasn't just surviving, she was growing, thriving, and the ranch was beginning to thrive with her. The knock on the front door came as Claire was finishing her morning coffee, the sun barely cresting over the horizon. She knew who it was before she opened it. Liam stood there, polished as ever in his tailored blazer and crisp shirt. His smile was tight, forced, the way it always was when he wanted something. "Claire," he greeted, his voice slick with condescension. "May I come in?" She stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. The last thing she wanted was his energy tainting the home she was beginning to make her own. "What do you want, Liam?" she asked, crossing her arms. His expression shifted to mock surprise. "Is that any way to talk to an old friend? I came to see how you're managing with all this." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch, as if it were beneath his notice. "I'm managing just fine," she replied coolly. He chuckled, a low sound that prickled her nerves. "Claire, let's not pretend this is your world. You're out of your depth here. Running a ranch? Balancing budgets? You don't have the skills for it. But lucky for you, I have a solution." Her stomach tightened as he pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and held it out to her. "This is my offer," he said smoothly. "It's generous, considering the condition this place is in. Sell me the ranch, and you can walk away with more money than you've ever dreamed of. You won't have to deal with the stress or the work. You can move on, Claire. Start fresh." She didn't take the folder. "This isn't about the ranch, is it? It's about control. You can't stand the fact that I have something you want, something you think you're entitled to." Liam's mask slipped, revealing the man beneath, the one she'd spent years trying to please, only to be torn down at every turn. His jaw tightened, and his voice turned icy. "Don't be naive. This land is wasted on you. Do you even know how much debt William left behind? How much it'll take to keep this place afloat? You think you're winning by staying here, but you're just digging yourself a deeper hole." Claire stared at him, her heart pounding, but she refused to let him see her falter. "You think I can't handle this? Watch me." His laugh was sharp, cruel. "This isn't some fairy tale, Claire. You'll fail, and when you do, I'll be here to clean up the mess. But my offer won't be so generous next time." She stepped closer, her voice firm. "Get off my land, Liam, and don't come back." For a moment, he didn't move, his eyes narrowing as if assessing whether she was bluffing. Then he shrugged, slipping the folder back into his briefcase. "Suit yourself," he said, turning on his heel. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Claire watched him walk away, her hands trembling with adrenaline. She knew he wasn't finished. Liam wasn't the type to take no for an answer, but she also knew she wasn't the same woman he'd walked all over for years. The battle had just begun, but for the first time, Claire felt ready to fight. The ranch, bathed in golden sunlight, buzzed with life and activity. The hum of machinery blended with the rhythmic beat of hooves against the ground, and laughter carried on the wind. Claire stood by the newly painted barn, watching as the workers, now her team, moved with purpose and pride. It had taken months of grueling work, sleepless nights, and moments of self-doubt, but the transformation was undeniable. The ranch was no longer a decaying relic of the past. It was thriving, a harmonious blend of tradition and modern efficiency. Claire had poured her heart into every decision. She'd worked alongside Hank to modernize the irrigation system, invested in renewable energy, and introduced sustainable farming practices that boosted productivity without compromising the land's integrity. She'd opened the ranch to visitors, offering guided tours, horseback riding lessons, and a farm-to-table cafe that showcased their organic produce. The community, initially skeptical, had come around. They admired her tenacity and the respect she showed for the land's legacy. Slowly, they started showing up, supporting the ranch, recommending it to friends, and even volunteering during busy seasons. As the day wound down, Hank approached, wiping his hands on a rag. His face, lined with years of hard work, broke into a smile. "You did it, Claire," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. She smiled back, her chest swelling with pride. "We did it, Hank. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "William would have been proud. He always said this place needed someone with vision, and you've got that in spades." Later that evening, Claire sat on the porch of the main house, the horizon painted in shades of orange and pink. She held a weathered envelope in her hands, William's final letter, the last she'd found among his papers. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the page, the familiar loops of his handwriting bringing a lump to her throat. "My dearest Claire," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've made the decision to stay. You've always had more strength and determination than you realized, and I knew you'd find your way here, to this land, to this life." Tears blurred her vision as she read on. "This ranch has always been more than a business. It's a sanctuary, a place where people come to heal, to find themselves, and now it's yours. Do with it what you will, but never doubt your ability to create something extraordinary. You've always been capable of greatness, Claire. I only wish I could be there to see it." The letter ended with a line that pierced her heart. "Find peace, my dear. Find happiness. You deserve nothing less." She pressed the letter to her chest, the weight of her journey crashing over her. She thought of the woman she'd been when she first arrived, a shadow of herself, burdened by fear and doubt. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had faced down her demons and carved out a life worth living. Looking out at the ranch, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for William, for the land, for the people who had stood by her, and for herself, for refusing to give up. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Claire smiled, a quiet, contented smile. She was finally home. The night air was cool and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of sage and freshly tilled earth. Claire stood on the balcony of the rancho's main house, her hands resting on the worn wooden railing. Below her, the ranch stretched wide and vibrant under a silver moon. She could see the distant glow of the barn, where the last of the workers were finishing their tasks for the evening. The soft murmur of their voices carried up to her, mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a symphony of life, of effort, of something she had helped create. Her gaze swept over the fields, where rows of healthy crops swayed gently. The pastures were dotted with grazing horses, their silhouettes serene against the star-speckled sky. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a testament to everything she had endured and overcome. For so long, the rancho had been a place of pain, a reminder of the betrayal and loss that had shattered her world. But now, it stood as a beacon of resilience. The land didn't just survive, it flourished. And so had she. Claire took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. She thought about William's letter and his faith in her, even in his absence. She thought about Hank, the workers, and the community that had become her family. And she thought about herself, the woman who had arrived here broken and uncertain, and the one who now stood strong, proud, and unafraid. As the wind tousled her hair, Claire allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Triumph and peace filled her heart. But a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered of new possibilities. There was still so much to do, so much to explore. The rancho was her anchor, but it didn't have to be her boundary. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Hank stepped onto the balcony, a bottle of wine in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. "Thought you might want to toast your victory," he said, his eyes twinkling. Claire smiled and took a glass as he poured. They clinked their glasses together, the quiet sound punctuating the stillness of the night. "To the rancho," Hank said. "To new beginnings," Claire added. As they sipped their wine, Claire looked out at the land one more time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength that had brought her here. This was her home, her sanctuary, her triumph, and it was only the beginning.